You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
This podcast is brought to you by Carvana. Carvana makes car selling fast and easy from start to finish. Enter your license plate or VIN and get a real offer in seconds, down to the penny. If you accept, Carvana will come pick up your car from your driveway. Or you can drop it off at one of our car vending machines. Either way, you get paid instantly. It's fast, transparent, and 100% online. Car selling that saves your time. That's Carvana.
Carvana.
Pickup fees may apply.
Hey friends, this is Audie Cornish, host of CNN This Morning and The Assignment, and guess what? Every story you care about, every angle you want unpacked is now streaming on CNN. That means you can catch my show or other CNN programming whenever you want on your favorite device. And a subscription also gets you access to exclusive video series and unlimited articles. So subscribe to CNN at cnn.com/subscription.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another History of the Second World War interview. This time, I'm joined by Hans Smith, the author of Bombs Away, a B-17B pilot's small part in a big war. This is a biography of his great uncle Herbert Small, who was a member of the 384th Bomb Group during the war. Hans, thank you for joining us here today.
Thank you, Wesley, for having me, and it's a great opportunity to talk about the book.
I always like to ask when somebody decides to write a book about a family member, sort of what prompted you to want to do the research and the writing and the work to kind of put this book together?
Yeah, the inspiration really came from, and I talk about this in the introduction of the book, a trip my wife and I took to, part of the vacation we took was to the Normandy region of France a couple of years ago. And I'd always been interested in World War II history, so part of that trip was meant to see some of the battlefields and museums and some of the amazing bits of history from over there. And my family immediately started talking to me about, well, you've got to go see your Uncle Herb's grave. Uncle Herb was someone I'd heard about my whole life, but never knew much about him other than he had passed away during World War II. So come to find out, he's actually buried in the famous American cemetery in Normandy, and that was already on the agenda to go see, so it was perfect. When we finally got to the cemetery, we actually didn't think we were going to be able to see the grave because everything is so manicured and perfect and well kept. The pathways are roped off, so you don't get a chance to just meander amongst the graves. And we wound up talking to a guide who then said, as soon as you learned we were family of someone buried there, brought us right to his grave location. And he carried with him three things that are still very powerful to me today is two little flags that you might find at little kids waving at a parade for Memorial Day or something like that, one American and one French, and then a little Tupperware container of sand. And so he put the flags next to either side of the grave and then handed me the Tupperware and said, take a handful of the sand, which coincidentally was taken directly from Omaha Beach, which was already a very powerful thing to think about. And he said to smear it across the grave, the engravings on the grave, because these stones are just pure white marble. So in a picture, you would barely see the engravings if you didn't have some way to sort of highlight it. And so I wiped it across the grave. And then my wife and I stood back for that moment of just taking it all in. And coincidentally, taps started playing from somewhere else in the cemetery as part of the ceremony. And the two of us were reduced to tears for reasons we really didn't fully understand at the moment. And then over the next few weeks, my brain just kept coming back to that moment and realized that I had to find out who this guy was.
I was over there a little over a year ago now, and kind of for lack of a better word, the vibes of those cemeteries is like there's weird feeling that when you're in there with how nice it looks, but what it means and sort of why all those gravestones are there. Like it's a very serene environment. But I love what they do with the sand. Like that is such a powerful way of sort of honestly solving a problem, I guess,
Right.
if you want to take pictures.
Yeah, it really is. And, for those unfamiliar with the location, it's literally just a couple of 100 yards up off of Omaha Beach itself, which the idea that you're standing literally in the footsteps of the men who fought and died there and were wounded there. And then, the sand comes from the beach, you put it into the engraving, and eventually it washes back out. And it's almost like a full circle sort of event of, like you said, solving a problem, but also symbolic in a lot of ways.
Coming back kind of to your book and to your great uncle, the kind of the subject of the book, before the war, like with millions of other people around the world who got involved in the Second World War, your great uncle seemed like just a normal guy. He wasn't, he was just a guy. So what was his life like before the war? Like who was this person who would eventually, be in the 384th bomb group?
He was he actually lived in the same little town that I wound up growing up in Western Massachusetts, a little town called Sheffield. Of back then, at the turn of the 20th century, maybe about 2,200 people lived there, and there's not that many more living there these days. He was the second of five children. He and his older brother both enlisted early in 1942, and they were just living kind of a simple, small town agricultural life. School, going to the library, playing basketball, chores, and all that sort of thing. Immediately before the war, he had actually was studying at a school out near Boston to become a nurse. And he had talked about going on from there to possibly medical school and beyond, and signed up just, let me see, 2 or 3 months after Pearl Harbor occurred, as so many young men did in those days, to try to defend their country, I guess you would say. And then, yeah, he was just living a normal life, like I said, just a regular kid. And then it finally got called up in August of 1942 to begin his training.
Yeah. So what does his training and then I guess sort of the period of the war for him between when he's called up and when he sort of first goes to Europe and has his experiences. What is that window like? What is he doing? How long is it?
What's really interesting to me is it probably felt long to the guys going through training, but they were from day one to in country fighting the war in a matter of about 14 months, which sounds insane now. I don't know how long, an F-18 pilot trains for, but I'm guessing it's longer than 14 months. And these guys started off, they shipped them out roughly August of 42 from the East Coast all the way to the West Coast in California. There were a lot of bases out there simply because there's just more real estate in places like California, Nevada, Arizona. So he was stationed at a couple of different bases in California. There was several stages to the training, a standard basic training, then on to primary school, secondary school, where he essentially continue graduating from one level of plane to another. Simple training planes onto smaller bombers, and finally, over the course of about 12, 13 months, you have trained fully on the plane that you would then take into war. So he was at Roswell briefly before it became known as, Alien Central or UFO Central, and then finished up the last round of training, bouncing around several different bases up into Washington State, over in Florida, briefly through the Midwest as they picked up their various planes to eventually ferry them over to England by way of either a northern route up through Canada and Newfoundland, or down through South America and across through northern Africa. Depending on which area they were going to, the 8th Air Force was where he was stationed, which was mainly flying out of England.
Okay, so he probably took the northern ferry route on his way over?
Right, yeah. They went up through Labrador and Newfoundland and across either Greenland or Iceland. I've had mixed stories about which one they went through. Iceland makes more sense to me, but eventually they just had to hop over and stop where they could. And the Masters of the Air movie did a really nice job of depicting that for people that are interested in that experience.
He flies over to the 8th Air Force stationed in England. Do we know what his first, at least couple of missions looked like, right? What his experiences were during those?
Yeah, so he was stationed at one of the many bases over there called Grafton Underwood, and their first mission was in late November. So he had a few weeks to kind of acclimate, maybe get used to how base life works. But his first mission was a mine that they were trying to destroy in Norway, of all places. A mine that was critical to war production for the Germans. There was a particular type of metal that was very critical to munitions, tanks, all sorts of parts. So what's really interesting to me is the varied types of missions that they could be on, ranging from anything that could be an implement of war down to railways and air bases and all sorts of things. So it was very varied as to what they would hit.
I think a lot of people, when they picture a B-17 pilots or a B-17 crews sort of missions, I think it's very typical to always picture like the massive raids of Berlin or whatever, right? But like when you actually dig into like what a lot of these men did on like a mission to mission basis, like they were everywhere doing, like they were bombing all kinds of stuff around Europe.
Yeah, one particular mission, they were trying to knock out a specific ship that was a blockade ship that was, keeping supplies from going up a particular river on the coast of France. So yeah, it could have been anything from, like you said, Berlin and something that sounds grandiose and vital to some smaller scale thing that, when added to the bigger picture, made a lot of sense.
Over the course of his missions, are there any particular kind of, I guess, adventure sounds like a super positive word for somebody going into combat, but the sort of, I guess, experiences that kind of stand out to you as you're looking through them?
Yeah. So one of the interesting things I found was that he didn't. So they would train with a regular crew of 10 guys, typically, which would be your pilots and co-pilot, your bombardier, navigator, radio man, engineer, and so forth, and then an array of gunners making up a full 10-man crew. And he didn't actually, it was standard for a pilot getting into the theater of war to not fly his first couple of missions with his own guys, because what they would do is they want to get that new pilot some experience with guys who had already been there. So it took him 2 or 3 missions, I think, to get with his regular crew of guys, because they were putting you up with the seasoned veterans. And the funny thing about that was these guys who were considered the seasoned veteran type guys had only been there themselves 3 or 4 months. But it was such a demanding schedule. These guys were flying missions 3 and 4 times a week sometimes. The 8th Air Force had a really tough 1943. The summer of 43 and then October of 43 were just brutal on the number of men killed or lost in action in terms of POWs and other casualties. So yeah, it was a very quick proving ground for these guys who got in and then were considered grizzled vets after 2 or 3 months. So yeah, they would put the new guys up with them, get them some real world training, and then get them back to their regular crew of guys typically.
Yeah. And so how many missions did he end up sort of participating in or going on?
Yeah, a total of 27, but that comes with an asterisk. 4 of those were scrubbed for various reasons once they got off the ground. Weather and technical, mechanical difficulties sometimes sent planes back to base. He actually was credited with 23, including his final mission. And one of the interesting bits that a lot of people talk about in regards to the missions is the number of missions that would be, once the men completed them, they'd be sent home. So originally it was 25 missions, which already, based on the number of casualties, the rate of casualties, was considered by many of the men nearly impossible to achieve. 25 missions, the average lifespan of a crew was typically 13 to 15 missions. So getting 25 just seemed completely out of reach for most folks. And then General Doolittle came in of the Tokyo raid fame, in early 1944 as the new commander of the 8th Air Force and up that to 30 missions. So something that was already seemed nearly impossible was boosted by 5 more missions. So by the original standards, my uncle arguably could have gotten sent home if those couple of those scrubbed missions had counted. And so you just sort of think about these things when you look over the history and think, well, if the rules had been slightly different, if the circumstances had been different in terms of missions not being scrubbed, then would he have come home? Because he would have hit the original 25 mission mark. Yeah.
One of the images I always get in my mind, and I'm sure others do as well, when thinking about these bombing missions, is B-17s getting shot up by all kinds of stuff. Do you know, like, if he was in a situation on any of these missions where his plane was damaged? Like, was he flying a damaged plane back or anything like that?
Yeah, there was. I never saw any evidence of such heavy damage that it would warrant one of these great tales that you hear told. Their original plane, I know that it was called Little Barney, was their original plane. The naming of the planes is a great story in of itself. But their original plane got damaged enough that it was knocked out of service for a couple of months. But I never really found any big description of it. Between flak damage and fighter damage, I don't know if it was shot up dramatically or just suffered some strategic damage that kept it out of the war for a bit. But there was one great story from one of his colleagues that was relatively well known over there, sort of a famous or infamous pilot, where he brought back the plane nearly in pieces. Sometimes these things looked like they were held together with duct tape and bits were falling off, and his landing gear weren't operable, so he had to do a belly landing at the base. And so he comes in, they said it came in roaring at high speeds, higher than normal speeds because of whatever damage was incurred, and he belly lands on the tarmac, skids with sparks flying, and just right out of Hollywood, skids, nearly plows into another plane at the end of the runway. And by the time the crews got there, the fire crews, the medic crews, and so forth, he had jumped out of the plane on his own power, was standing on the tarmac asking somebody to light his cigar. It was something like out of the A-Team or some movie. He said, "What took you guys so long?" or something like that. And it just seemed like something out of central casting. He just was such bravado. I guess it was pretty cool.
On the topic of not fun stories, I don't have a good transition here. You mentioned that his last mission was after 23 full missions, 27 with scrubs. So, like, what was his last mission? Sort of, do we know what happened?
The war had been kind of transitioning in terms of the air war, and in the February and March in particular of 1944, they were shifting their focus towards trying to knock out the air coverage for D-Day. So the Allies really wanted to be able to dominate the entire landscape on D-Day. So part of that was, let's knock out the Luftwaffe. So everything turned to doing damage to the fighters, the ability for the Germans to put anything in the air. But alongside of that, the bases, there were these V1 rockets that were being launched from the Normandy region and were wreaking havoc in London and other major cities in England. So there were these sites stationed all throughout Normandy that was sort of a side focus. And those were actually considered relatively easy missions because they weren't expecting much fighter resistance. The fighters were mainly in the Berlin, central Germany area at that point, but there was still a lot of flak. So on April 27th of 1944, his crew was sent up to tackle what they called on a milk run, which was supposed to be a nice, easy mission, not a lot of resistance expected, and even flak was expected to be light. And it was over the Cherbourg's, just south of Cherbourg area of Normandy. So they were trying to take out one of these V1 rocket sites. So coincidentally, this was Herb's first mission that he was going to be in the pilot seat versus the co-pilot. So he had 22 missions. He had been there. He was always the co-pilot for his guys. This was kind of his first real mission as a pilot. And they wound up giving him, instead of flying with his regular crew, he flew with a bunch of guys who had never been up before, except for one of them. So these guys had all been in country now only for a couple of weeks and didn't have much experience yet. So my first impression was, well, gosh, if he had just stayed with his regular guys, because they were up on the same mission in a different plane, maybe he'd have been okay. So they get over the target, over Normandy for the V1 rocket site, and they just got hit with a very unlucky shot from flak from the ground, right in the cockpit, and all 10 men were killed on impact when they crashed. There were no survivors. His regular crew was on the same mission, and I actually was able to get from a surviving family member of his ball turret gunner on his regular crew a very good description of the event, because he was in the ball turret watching as the plane with his comrade went down. So that was just an incredible description, how, the witnessing that event. So at any rate, jump forward to a week and a half later, when I'm thinking in my research that, if he had just stayed with his regular guys, he might have been okay. A week and a half later, over nearly the same site, his regular crew was shot down in almost the exact same place. A few of those guys did survive, but the rest of them, including the pilot and co-pilot, were killed. So it kind of came to realize that for me, it was sort of a moment of when your number is called, when fate is up, however you want to say it, there's no avoiding it.
It's interesting because they probably sent him up there with that crew because they were expecting an easy mission, right? That was,
right.
Hopefully not going to be a huge problem. And then it was.
Yeah. I mean, those guys, the other ones, the 9 rookies, so to speak, needed to get up there and get some seasoning, get some experience. And yeah, exactly that. They probably figured, okay, this other Herb's been up there a bunch. He knows what he's doing in the air, and that'll get these guys some good training. But yeah, people on the ground in the area, in that area of Normandy, mentioned that there was a particular gunner that was very good from the flak gunner guys from the Germans. And I've also often wondered if it would be possible to find out whether or not it was the same crew of guys that was at that gun that knocked out both planes. I'm sure that's not something the records would hold, but
yeah,
that would be an interesting little fact to figure out.
This episode is brought to you by LinkedIn. Psst, healthcare pros, word's out, and it's too good to keep quiet. Look, LinkedIn is revolutionizing job hunting, making it possible to search by specialty, shift preference, and salary. Endless scrolling is out. Whether it's a mental health therapist or dental hygienist, finding the perfect role is faster and easier than ever. Head to linkedin.com/healthcare and start your search today.
Once upon a mundane morning, Barb's day got busy without warning. A realtor in need of an open house sign. No, 50 of them, and designed before 9.
My head hurts.
Any mighty tools to help with this plight? Aha! Barb made her move. She opened Canva and got in the groove.
Bulk creating Canva sheets. Create 50 signs fit for suburban streets.
Done in a click, all complete.
Sweet!
Now, imagine what your dreams can become when you put imagination to work at canva.com.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about is you are not a professional historian. Like, this is not your day job of writing these books.
Right.
This is a personal family story for you. But how did you go from, being in Normandy, knowing that you had this great uncle in this cemetery? Like, how did you get started with your research for this book? How did you kind of, actually start the research process?
Right. Well, the first step really was talking with family members. One of the most incredible resources I had was that 2 of his little sisters were still alive at the beginning of my project. They had passed during the writing of it, one of them in 2023 and the other in 2024. So these were two of my still living great aunts who were the little sisters of Herb at 93 and 96 years old. So the stories that they were able to share with me and the pictures and just anecdotes of all these things were so incredible, and nothing you could find in a history book. They were telling me about times that he walked them to school, or when he was, as my one great aunt said, when he was shooting hoops. And the fact that a 93-year-old lady was talking about shooting hoops just made me smile. But they shared with me letters that he had written home from training in the war. They still had a copy of the letter that his closest friend wrote home to his mother upon learning that he was gone. So that was really the inspiration for me to go, okay, there's really something here as far as the story is concerned. And I started digging into doing some online research. The 384th Bomb Group has an amazing website that they curate. It's a treasure trove of information and documents. You can literally type in the name of any of the participants, any of the members of the 384th, and it'll tell you every mission they were on, cross-referenced by the other guys on the mission details, the plane numbers and names. I mean, without that website, the book probably doesn't get written. And they were so gracious, the guys who run it, it's 384thbombgroup.com. They immediately said, yes, use any of the pictures you like, just give us credit for them, etc. And yeah, unbelievable resource. And there's a lot of those out there, I found, websites that are dedicated to these various groups because people want to preserve this information, the pictures, the documents, the stories. These guys are all, the men are all dying. They're going away very quickly. And I think more and more people are realizing that if we don't tell their stories, no one will.
Yeah. And it sounded like you were able to get in touch with maybe the families of some of his crewmates along the way as well.
Yeah, that's been one of the most rewarding experiences of all this. Is so the magic of the internet, right, and Facebook and everything else is finding people. That's what it does the best. So I was able to locate the sister of one of the ball turret gunner, who's 92, I believe now, and she had a handwritten journal she gave me a copy of from her big brother, who was the ball gunner, writing down little post-mission impressions. Oh, we flew over Paris and it was beautiful, or there was a lot of fighter coverage today. All these different little things from a guy who was 20 years old, something like that. And I've met and corresponded with nieces and nephews and grandchildren and sons and daughters of the men and women that were over there. I actually got an email shortly after the publication of the book from a man who said he found the book on his Kindle. He was looking for a new book, and he realized, oh, this is a story about B-17s. His father was a B-17 pilot. And then he drilled down further and said, oh, my father was also in the 8th Air Force. He was also in the 384th Bomb Group. And then drills down even further and finds out that he was in the same squadron. So it went, 8th Air Force, Bomb Group, squadron was kind of the funnel down. And long story short, it turns out that it's almost a guarantee that the two men knew each other. If you looked at the time they were in country, the time they served, and the small number of crewmen and pilots that would be in a bomber squadron, they had to have known each other. And he paid me one of the nicest compliments I've ever gotten for it. He said that the book was like sitting down to coffee with his father again, listening to the old war stories. And he and I are buddies now. We're pen pals of a sort. But yeah, meeting the family members has been really just incredible.
Yeah, I bet. And it's so cool that these kinds of stories, these kind of family memories and family histories can help bring people together that, lived half a country apart or whatever, and
Yeah.
just kind of feels random, but it's really cool.
Yeah, it's great. There's just another little quick side story. There's a lot of groups over in England itself that are preserving the bases and the history surrounding the bases because they were just as involved as we were. So many men and women of U.S. servicemen and English women married and had families, some 50,000 of them. And so there's a big following for the bases and the history and these bomber groups. And there's a museum over there on the location of Grafton Underwood in one of the restored buildings that guys over there run. And we've actually sent over a bunch of the books and they sell over there. But it's just kind of surreal to realize I've met people now on two continents that are part of this big extended family. And it makes me feel much cooler now that I've got guys over there who'll call me mate when they interact with me. I'm a lot cooler than I probably am overall. But
Yeah. Yeah, and so you mentioned you had the journal of the ball turret gunner. Uh, Herbert did not keep a journal. Is that correct? Or we don't
yeah,
have
to
it?
my knowledge, he didn't. I'm not sure why, because frankly, he was a very cerebral sort of person in terms of the descriptions I've been given of him. He was a voracious reader as a child and young man. I would have expected him to do something like journaling or having a diary or something like that. It's possible that it was lost in the shuffle afterwards because it wasn't long after he passed that most of the other guys he knew got killed. So I don't know who else would have maybe been looking after his footlocker or whatever the equivalent would have been to send those things home. Several things did make it home, but I've never heard talk of any kind of a journal now.
Yeah, how did the family find out? Like, what was the delay, and then when did his, I guess, um, that those pieces of kit or whatever make their way over to the United States?
His closest buddy, which was another pilot called Earl Allison, wrote the letter home to his mother the following day. I don't know what the time frame was when she actually received it, given the delays of mail and so forth. Everything had to be edited and so forth for safety and all that. So I don't know what the timing of the receiving of the letter was. Uh, Sadly, it didn't get received by her before the person who wrote it himself was actually killed in action shortly afterwards. That's a good question. I never thought to ask the family when and how they received the rest of the materials, jackets or wings or whatever that he may have had when he was over there.
So I guess, other than him keeping a journal, which would be a priceless sort of
Yeah.
artifact, a priceless understanding, like, was there any other information that you kind of wish you had, or wish you could have access to, that maybe doesn't exist anymore, or was never available?
I think if I had a wish list, and they may be out there somewhere, you see little snippets here and there, but I would love to see more video of the men on the bases. And if I was able to come across a video that included him a bit, even if it were just something brief, a few seconds, um, it just would be, yeah, I think just an interesting thing to see. Um, just my own personal curiosity. I had never even seen a picture of Herb until I started the project, which to me seems mind blowing. Maybe as a young child, there may have been a picture on my grandfather's mantle or something like that, but I don't recall. So it was really an interesting thing for me to see the first time and realize the family resemblance and go, oh yeah, that's definitely somebody from my family. And there were, speaking of the journals and so forth, there were two or three other guys that were regular crew members with him that did well after the war in their later years wrote memoirs, and I was able to get one of those loaned to me from a family member, and the other I found on a university website as part of a historical collection. So those were really good descriptions of the events. Two of those guys spent several months as POWs in the Stalag system, and were part of the long march in the winter of it would have been 1945. That was so brutal, some 800 miles in sub-zero temperatures and so forth. So those bits, the memoirs and the journals of those guys were also just super valuable for telling the story. Yeah, and if there's one sort of takeaway, people talk about sacrifice and the valor of the men and what they did for us. And I actually rewatched for innumerable number of times over the weekend the movie Saving Private Ryan. And at the very end, I think it says it all in terms of the way we should maybe be thinking about this. And Tom Hanks's Captain Miller character is speaking his dying words to Matt Damon's Private Ryan character. And he tells him, earn this, like meaning not just remember what we did, but live a life that's deserving of the sacrifice, which I thought was really powerful.
I agree. The power of that power of that moment, and then the power that remembrance and sort of memory and remembering what these people did and how they the experiences they had during the war, and then for so many of them how they died, right, is such an important part of that remembrance. And I'm glad you wrote a book about a person I'd never heard about and never would have heard about, that now I know about some of his experiences.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I so appreciate you, being willing to have me on here to talk with me. And thank you so much.